Good morning, you're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Danny Laurel.
And I'm Jess De Los Santos. Here are the biggest stories to kickstart this trading day Thursday. First, green bonds, and now here comes the blue bonds. The ADB says it's working with the Philippine government to develop debt instruments which are meant to fund ocean conservation projects.
The hotel industry is asking for government aid following the removal of mandatory quarantine for fully vaccinated travelers.
Fresh data from the PSA, unemployment slightly increased in December 2021.
And the DILG says it will look into the possible violations made during the proclamation rallies of presidential candidates. We begin our broadcast with the Asian Development Bank now working with the Philippine government to develop blue bonds.
Now, these debt instruments are issued to support investments in fisheries and ocean conservation projects. The Manila-based lender says a feasibility study is now underway and that they are optimistic about sustainability bonds in the Philippines. Finance Chief Sonny Dominguez earlier said that the country plans to offer $500 million in green bonds to fund climate mitigation projects. As for blue bonds, the ADB says the Philippines has a strong marine economy with coastline tourism activities generating revenues and jobs in the countryside. Now, in September last year, the ADB issued its first dual tranche blue bonds denominated in Australian and New Zealand dollars to fund ocean conservation projects in Asia Pacific. Now on to some newly released economic figures. Unemployment slightly picked up in December last year. The jobless rate stood at 6.6%. That's higher than the 6.5% rate recorded in November 2021. Month on month, the total number of jobless Filipinos increased by 113,000 to 3.27 million. The PSA said unemployment increased just as the overall labor force participation rate also picked up in December. This means that more than 900,000 Filipinos aged 15 years or older, either employed or unemployed, have been added to the labor force. Now, the hotel industry is calling for government aid after losing their mandatory quarantine business. Recall that on January 28, the palace announced that fully vaccinated travelers are allowed to enter the country only with a negative RT-PCR test and without having to undergo mandatory quarantine. Now, the new policy on returning Filipinos has been in force since February 1st, while the restrictions are removed on foreigners starting today. Philippine Hotel Owners Association says hotels are seeing a drop in occupancy following the removal of mandatory quarantine. The group is now asking the government to provide hotels with financial assistance over the next 6 to 12 months. Quarantine requirements had been lifted for fully vaccinated travelers, as new cases in the country continue to decline. Meanwhile, infections have been at a 3,000 level for 2 consecutive days, and if this downtrend continues, the Octa Research Group says the daily case count could drop to 3 digits by next month. Still, Octa warns against complacency, especially during the election season, as campaign activities may be super spreader events. All right, Dan, February thus far looking to be rosy with Wall Street paving the way for gains. Give us a lowdown.
Exactly that, Jess. I mean, we started a bit on the rocky side, especially with oil threatening their continuing that rally, but that seems to have plateaued for a while, at least for a day. And you can see Wall Street jumping overnight. The S&P 500 up by 1.5%. That's actually the most that Wall Street has rallied in February so far. And this, of course, on the back of oil stalling around $90 a barrel, in part on the possibility that there might be a nuclear deal with Iran, and that could bring supply relief to a very tight market. Another one that's also enjoying this is our local index. Take a look at that. Still above 7,500 here, and we did break that level yesterday. I just wanted to say that was a new 2-year high yesterday. So we're still continuing with breaking those records. We're up by 0.4% in just the past 3 days of trade. We are now up by 2%. This, of course, amid the start of the campaign period. And as you mentioned already earlier on, Octa saying Metro Manila now low risk for COVID. Let's take a look at the movers very quickly. Metro Bank leading the pack here together with Bloomberry, but it's not everyone in the green. In fact, there's several here that are sitting out this rally. Particularly, you've got Globe Telecom down by 4.4%. This as investors are continuing to digest those earnings, fourth quarter earnings, as well as the full year 2021 results. They're also with them in the loser board, let's say, or Meralco as well as ICTSI. But there's one in focus today, and that is Jollibee. Take a look at that, up by 0.6% to 243 pesos per share. This, of course, as they just broke their earnings. Guess what, Jess? Highest quarterly profit ever. That means that they're higher than the pre-pandemic levels of the fourth quarter of 2019. They beat the estimates. The estimate of Bloomberg was around 3.11 billion pesos, and the fourth quarter came out at 3.24 billion pesos. And at that, that's 60% increase year on year compared to 2020. And as I mentioned, of course, 2020 was a pandemic year, but still much higher than the 2019 levels. They've also reversed the losses of 2020. That was a loss of 11.5 billion pesos in 2020. They've now reversed that, and they have a net income of 5.94 billion pesos in the entire 2021. Apart from that, looks like they're not stopping. Capex will be 17.8 billion pesos this year. That's 2022 versus the 7.8 billion pesos that they spent in 2021. And just a quick check on their competitors, of course. Take a look at Max is here, also enjoying actually an uptrend, up by 3.3%. You've got as well Shakey's and Figaro enjoying a bump up, maybe excited also for their prospects and whether they will also be together with Jollibee in terms of a recovery. Now, Jess, banks have been in focus the past 2 years, of course. You've got investors watching how banks have accelerated this digital push. And we have with us this morning Mon Duarte. He's the Executive Vice President and Head of Transaction Banking and Platform Development over at Union Bank to give us their update. Good morning, Sir Mon, and welcome.
Good morning, Danny. Thank you for having me on the show this morning.
All right, sir, let's take a bird's eye view here. You've got Union Bank. That was the pioneer in using blockchain technology here in the Philippines, in digitalizing. You already said pre-pandemic, way before, that you were shifting towards becoming a tech company rather than a bank. That's something that has stuck to me. But tell us, how has this changed during the course of the pandemic? Have you been able to harness these efforts? Have you benefited from that? Give us a bit more nuance here.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I'd like to say that Union Bank, we ended up being at the right place in a bad time, in a way. What I mean by that is the pandemic crisis has really proven really that digitization is the way forward. And it essentially, it accelerated the wave of the transformation. And since I guess Union Bank was already, let's say, surfing the crest of that wave, we really benefited in a way because of all the practical benefits and the real value that going digital in a pandemic context delivers. So we've continued with so many of our initiatives, not just in terms of our retail experience. I think many people are familiar with the online app that we have introduced and have continued to enhance, as well as the experience that our retail customers can expect at our digitally transformed branches. But we're also doing it in our back-end systems on the corporate banking and transaction banking side by leveraging technologies such as blockchain, which you mentioned, and we're going to be talking about a little bit more about that. In fact, what we're talking about today in supply chain financing is actually built on a blockchain platform.
Okay, so we'll get to that in a bit, but just to ask you on that first point, sir, what are your targets for this year when it comes to the bank's, digitalization push, the impact on this on your costs, the impact on the bottom line, especially as we are, 2 years past the pandemic and hopefully looking at a recovery year this year?
Well, as I mentioned, and well, actually, as you had mentioned, we've started on this journey way ahead of everybody else in the industry in terms of initiating and taking a position that, it's digitize or perish, right? So we have made a lot of those investments already back over the last 4 or 5 years. Even way before the pandemic was anywhere in our reality. But we've continued on those investments. We're not quite done with a lot of our digitization efforts. We're doing a lot of things in terms of our systems, automation, and our transformation, moving everything onto cloud, for example. We have a lot of products that are still in development, but we are now expecting really to start to, I think it's starting to show that we are already experiencing the benefits in terms of cost saves. Even while the transactions have been surging tremendously during the pandemic because of the shift to digital, we've kept our costs relatively well managed, and that's really the promise of digital scale. It allows you to scale with a very small marginal cost increases, right?
Okay, sir, you mentioned that you're targeting the supply chain ecosystem in terms of financing the supply chain ecosystem. What exactly do you mean by the service, by this product, and how is this type of financing for the ecosystem different pandemic versus pre-pandemic?
Okay, thank you. Right. So what we're talking about today, and what I wanted to highlight to your viewers, is what Union Bank is doing in the space of supply chain financing. Now, that's a very generic sounding term, but let me put it this way: supply chain financing's goal is really to improve the cash flow efficiencies between trading partners, suppliers and their buyers, customers and their downstream and upstream business partners. By essentially making more efficient the processes around collections and disbursements, but most importantly, introduce community-based financing. All right. Let me try to unpack that a little bit, Danny, because there's a lot in that statement. Right. The central feature here really is that, well, if you look at it, 99+% of Philippine businesses are MSMEs, and some close to 60% of these businesses are really part of an ecosystem wherein they are a supplier, or let's say a downstream distributor of a large anchor principal, right? And that's the relationship. That's the ecosystem that we talk about. You have a large manufacturer or a large brand in the middle that's working with a bunch of distributors, or a manufacturer that has got a lot of suppliers. That's the ecosystem we're talking about, and it's that relation that we're able to leverage. So what that means, so digitization allows, is that what used to be a very costly, inefficient process of providing financing to the MSME side of that community, right, becomes much more efficient, much more enabled, and allows you to introduce, new, unique credit scoring approaches, so that these communities can have access to capital that previously they wouldn't have had under your more traditional lending criteria, right? So, and that can only make sense. That can only work in a digitized mode. You simply couldn't do these things. It's just too costly, and you wouldn't have the confidence in the information if you were trying to do all of this manually. And that's where the blockchain technology comes in to mitigate the risk involved in this data.
Very interesting, sir. But to what extent are micro, you talk about the smallest businesses here, and you talk about micro, those are, sari-sari stores, for instance. How can these business owners benefit from these things? Are they at a level of, so to speak, tech savviness, of readiness when it comes to digitalization to take advantage of such services?
The short answer is yes. Let's not, even your smallest sari-sari store, your smallest MSME, the most micro of the segment, are connected. They've got their cell phones, their smartphones, and essentially that's all they need, because all of these ecosystems, your large FMCGs who are using the sari-sari stores or distribution network, they're all moving to platforms. And it's those platforms, right, that are the places of business. This is where your sari-sari stores are going to start doing their ordering from. And that is where the information, the data that will come from, that will allow us, once we are invited into that ecosystem, to be able to insight and find ways to be able to support the financing requirements of these participants in these ecosystems.
Okay, and finally, sir, before we let you go, what do they need? How do they tap into this financing facility? How much capital should they be considering? And also, what's the bottom line benefit that the MSMEs will actually reap?
That's the beauty of this thing. As you said yourself, even the smallest types of businesses can participate in if they're as a part of a larger community in supply chain financing, right? So it's a very flexible model. We look at these things more holistically. We look at the total value transfer that happens in entire ecosystems from one principal down to how many members there are in their community. So it's and what makes it feasible is the digital aspect of it. So it's not as if we have to limit ourselves to just working with a certain level of MSME business size. Pretty much anybody can participate in this, right? It's a matter of bringing in the community as a whole. At the end of the day, really, what this means is that supply chain financing implemented digitally really introduces a new way of boosting the MSME segment, which is of those most affected during this pandemic, right? We all know that. Anything that can help to help these businesses get back on their feet should be appreciated and should be looked upon seriously. And that's what we're seeing now, working with the anchors. They're looking for ways to help their communities. And supply chain financing in this digital form really introduces new way of extending finance to these smaller participants to at an extent that they really simply did not have access to before.
Very interesting. So community financing turned digital together with the tools of blockchain, integrating them in the larger supply chain ecosystem. Thank you so much. That was, of course, Mon Duarte, Executive Vice President and Head of Transaction Banking and Platform Development at Union Bank.
Thank you.
Now, coming right up, the DILG will look into the possible campaign violations made during the proclamation rallies of presidential candidates.
More of that and other stories after the break. Stay with us.
You're still watching Business World Live here on One News. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel. Some presidential candidates visited parts of the country on Wednesday as they continued to woo voters nationwide.
Let's take a look at how candidates spent day 2 of their campaign with this recap from Romel Lopez.
After starting with a bang on day 1 of the campaign period, candidates now do more legwork as the election season heats up. Save for one presidential aspirant, former Senator Ferdinand Marcos Jr. No agenda for the unit team after making a big splash at the Philippine Arena in Bulacan. But whether or not we'll get to see Marcos Jr. in future forums, his camp says it depends on the format.
Mas na-appreciate ng tao yung 1-hour program na one-on-one. Mas maraming nasasagot extensively.
If unit team paused on Tuesday, Senator Manny Pacquiao's camp hit the ground running at the Pacman village in Sarangani. He touts the property as a fruit of his housing promise for every Filipino.
Sabihin, pamulitika itong akin. Matagal ko nang inumpisahan nito bago pa ako napasok sa politika.
Meanwhile, the tandem of Senators Ping Lacson and Tito Soto went to vote-rich Quezon City. Soto claims they got the support of QC Mayor Joy Belmonte. Belmonte, however, has yet to issue a formal endorsement for their bid. Manila Mayor Isko Moreno meanwhile conducted a sortie in Rizal on Wednesday. Moreno already secured the support of Cebu Congressman JP Garcia, but whether or not this means securing Cebu province, Moreno had this to say.
Ayoko naman panguna si Governor Gwen. Si Congressman PJ, ano naman talaga, nagsuporta na yon. Tumutulong na si Kong PJ.
As for Labor leader Leody de Guzman, he admitted lapses in securing COMELEC's permit for their proclamation rally.
Konting drama pero naniniwala ako na maayos din ang ayos yung problema.
And Vice President Leni Robredo visited Sorsogon, where she held a rally with shared senatorial candidate Chis Escudero. Robredo also delivered a speech before their supporters and vowed to have an honest government if she gets elected. For News 5, Romel Lopez. We are One News.
Meanwhile, the COMELEC expressed its disappointment over the health protocol violations committed during the first day of the campaign period. COMELEC spokesman James Jimenez said that candidates could have controlled the situation if they wanted to, but many attendees were still spotted taking off their face masks during rallies and shouting during motorcades. For its part, the Interior Department will also be conducting a probe into the violations made during the proclamation rallies and various sorties spearheaded by national candidates.
Ito po ay iniimbestigahan na ngayon ng ating kapulisan at kung makikita po natin na paulit-ulit na itong gagawin, we will have no recourse but to prosecute them, no, by filing charges against them dahil maliwanag po ito na election offense.
Here are the other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. Average monthly wage rate of some occupations declined by almost 0.8% in 2020. This reflects the economy's record contraction caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The PSA says average monthly wages of time-rated workers across 190 monitored jobs declined by 9% to around 16,400 pesos from the over 18,000 in 2018. The median monthly basic pay, meanwhile, inched up by 0.6% to 13,600 pesos in 2020.
ADB says the outsourcing industry is poised to benefit from the RCEP trade deal, with opportunities still likely available even with a delayed start. A regional executive for ADB said the trade deal involving the ASEAN and other countries includes chapters on e-commerce and intellectual property rights. She said this establishes a set of unified rules on trade and services, which is seen supporting the local BPO sector. ITBAP seconds this, saying the trade deal would boost investment in the sector due to the stable regulatory environment and adherence to common international standards.
And that's a first look into the business day this Thursday, February 10, 2020. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.